Chapter 12. Eleanor and Richard. With Henry gone, no one disputed that Richard was the heir to the English throne. He immediately sent the royal knight William Marshal to England to free the Queen, but she was already at liberty. Her guards had not dared keep her captive once the news of Henry's death was known. William was amazed to see Eleanor looking so well. She had somehow managed to keep physically and mentally fit all those 15 long years. She seemed to have stored up her energy rather than lost it, and she emerged from prison a wiser and more understanding woman than she had ever been. She was 67 years old. No one objected when she assumed the responsibility of governing until Richard could be crowned. She went first to London and received oaths of allegiance on behalf of her son. Then, in a frankly political move, Eleanor toured England to gain popularity for Richard, so little known to the English. Having experienced how hateful prisons were, Eleanor opened their doors and released prisoners who had languished for a long time waiting for the king's justice. In Richard's name, she pardoned many criminals and trespassers against Henry's harsh forest rules. Poachers of the royal forest could be punished by mutilation or even death. Her life as a prisoner had somehow taught her compassion for the underprivileged, the poor and the sick. From a queen of the troubadours who had inspired romance and poetry, she became a queen with as much authority as a king. Her decisions were respected. Her concern for her subjects won their affection. Henry had been admired and feared. Eleanor was admired and loved. She introduced some much-needed reforms, including uniform systems of coins and of weights and measures. Coins varied from town to town, and the same amount of liquid was called a quart in one place, a pint in another, much to the confusion of buyers and sellers. Eleanor changed all that so that the same coins, the same weights and measures for liquids, for grain, and for cloth could be used throughout England. Like Henry's legal reforms, these helped to unify the kingdom. Eleanor endeared herself to monasteries and abbeys by relieving them of an annoying, expensive burden, the care and stabling of the king's horses. Henry had imposed this unpopular duty on monks and abbots so that he could always count on fresh horses whenever he needed them for his speedy trips through the land, or when he had a sudden whim to ride into the forest to hunt wild boar or deer. Then Eleanor paved the way for an enthusiastic reception of Richard and prepared London for the most splendid coronation it had yet witnessed. She knew that Richard, unlike his father, would enjoy being part of such a magnificent pageant. When Richard arrived in England, preparations were already underway. The streets of London were swept clean and strewn with fresh rushes. House fronts were decorated with banners and tapestries for the procession that wound its way to Westminster Abbey. Passing into the nave of the church came the dignitaries bearing the jeweled crown, the golden spurs, the sword of state, the royal scepters and coronation robes. Then came Richard, walking beneath a silken canopy held aloft by 4 barons. Eleanor gazed with rapture on her son, who looked every inch a king. Tall and shapely, he had the figure of a warrior knight, and his handsome face with its fine features was framed with amber gold hair. People thrilled to see he wore the Crusader's cross on his royal robe. Before the high altar, lighted by tall tapers, he was anointed with holy oil and crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He then gave his threefold oath to uphold the church, to suppress wrongdoing, and to temper justice with mercy. He was proclaimed Richard I, King of England, and as he took the throne, voices filled the abbey singing the Te Deum. This great spectacle was almost the last view the English had of their new king. He stayed in England only long enough to raise money for the crusade. He put up for sale everything he could think of, castles, manors, even public offices. "I would sell all London if I could find a buyer," he joked. But even Richard's money-raising did not dampen the ardor for the crusade. On both sides of the Channel, every town, village, and port was alive with activity. The sound of the forester's axe was heard felling huge oaks for shipbuilding. Ropes were made, sails sewn together. Every forge belched forth black smoke as smiths hammered out horseshoes, links for chainmail, helmets, shields, swords, spears, and bolts for the new, deadly weapon, the crossbow. So deadly that the church had banned its use except against the enemies of Christ. Peasants were busy slaughtering pigs and curing them into great slabs of bacon to be stashed on board ships. Never before had there been such well-thought-out preparations for a crusade. This was to be a strictly military expedition. There would be no women, no troubadours, no rabble of ill-equipped pilgrims tagging along. Eleanor followed Richard to the continent early in 1190, glad to leave behind the damp and fog of another English winter, to forget those 15 dreary years in Salisbury. She breathed more freely in her native land. Even her bitterness toward her husband softened. She gave a generous grant to the abbey where he was buried for the repose of Henry's soul. While Richard made his final preparations for the crusade, Eleanor planned for the future, though a regent had been appointed to rule while her son was overseas. Eleanor knew that Richard put most of his trust in her. In fact, she would be the real ruler of the vast Plantagenet realm, from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees while he was on crusade. Eleanor also had the unpleasant job of keeping close watch on her son John. Though John had inherited his family good looks and quick wit and could be charming at times, he was devious and scheming. As his father's favorite, he had been led to believe that he might be king instead of Richard. Eleanor had to make sure he didn't take advantage of Richard's absence to try to gain the English throne. The crusading host gathered at Vézelay, where Eleanor had heard Albert Bernard preach the Second Crusade 44 years earlier. She would not be going on the great adventure this time, but she could be proud of her son Richard. With his knightly bearing, his courtesy and military prowess, he far outshone King Philip, who was barely able to ride a horse and was known to be a coward in battle. Now that King Henry was dead, Richard and Philip, who had united against the old king when it had served their purpose, began to distrust each other, a bad omen for the joint enterprise. Eleanor was almost 70, but she was too busy to feel old. As soon as the Crusaders set off, she started on a long journey. She had been concerned that Richard, at 33, was still unmarried. She felt he must have a wife to provide him with an heir in order to foil any of John's attempts to gain the throne. South of her province of Aquitaine lay the kingdom of Navarre, whose Princess Berengaria, a gentle lady, virtuous and fair, had once met and pleased Richard. With her son's agreement, Eleanor planned to take Berengaria, the bride-to-be, to the island of Sicily, where the Crusaders were waiting out the winter before sailing to the Holy Land. Though the approach of wintry weather could have made many a man hesitate to cross the Alps, the courageous old queen was undaunted. Taking her young charge and a small escort, she set off on horseback through the lower Alps into northern Italy and on down its western coast. The trip took longer than expected, and it was almost Easter by the time they reached the tip of Italy, where one of Richard's ships conveyed them to Sicily. Eleanor's arrival at the Crusader camp caused a sensation. Few could believe that the old queen could make such a trip. Queen Eleanor, a matchless woman, wrote an admirer, still indefatigable for every undertaking, was the marvel of her age. Unfortunately, Eleanor's arrival among the Crusaders also touched off the old French antagonism for the queen. Though they viewed her with a certain awe, the French could not resist recalling her adventures on the Second Crusade and spreading anew the outworn gossip and ribald tales of her stay in Antioch. This did not mar Eleanor's joy in seeing her son once more before he set sail. Her only disappointment was to miss the wedding. She had even brought Richard a splendid wedding outfit, since weddings were banned during Lent. Eleanor dared not linger long, lest John cause trouble in her absence. She stayed in Sicily only 4 days, but during her short visit she saw her daughter, Joanna, Queen of Sicily, for the first time in 15 years. Since the wedding had been postponed, Eleanor, disregarding the ban against women on the crusade, arranged to send Joanna, recently widowed, as chaperone and companion for Berengaria in the Holy Land. Then Eleanor tore herself away from her 2 children, and once more took the long, difficult trip through Italy and over the Alps. After all her trouble, her hopes of Richard's having an heir were to come to nothing. Though Richard married Berengaria and had her crowned Queen of England, he rarely saw her after that. He had little interest in women and neglected his young bride. Luckily, Berengaria had the companionship of Joanna, who became her closest friend. Back from her long trip, Eleanor settled down in Normandy, near the Channel, keeping an eye on England as well as the continent. She became Richard's watchdog, seeing that John behaved and that the truce of God was observed. People were pleased to have her sign herself Eleanor by the grace of God, Queen of England, though she was really now only the Queen Mother. But everyone looked to her for leadership, marveling at her decisiveness, her fair-mindedness, her unceasing work for the good of the realm. Though John was a problem, spreading evil tales about his absent brother, she managed to keep him in check. Eleanor foresaw that the greatest menace to Richard would be King Philip. She knew enough about him not to trust him. She, as no one else, understood his determination to get revenge for all that his family and his kingdom had suffered from the Plantagenets. Her fears materialized sooner than she expected. After only 6 months, Philip, pleading sickness, abandoned the crusade and returned home. Both Philip and Richard had contracted a strange fever, causing their hair and nails to fall out during their long siege of the enemy's seaport, Acre. Philip became sick in mind as well as body. His real trouble was jealousy of his more glamorous, fearless companion in arms. At every turn, Richard stole the glory with deeds of valor and chivalry that won him the name of Richard the Lionheart. The troops adored Richard, and everyone looked to him as the real leader of the crusade. Philip couldn't stand being so overshadowed by his co-leader. Complaining of still being sick and very angry, he departed for France, but not before Richard extracted his oath to keep the truce of God. The Germans, who had been fighting the crusade long before Richard appeared, resented the English king too. When Acre finally fell to the Crusaders, Richard arrogantly claimed the victory for the English and set himself up in the royal palace. When he saw the German banner run up next to his, he defiantly had it thrown into a muddy ditch. At this insult, many Germans abandoned the crusade, vowing vengeance on the English king. Richard was left to carry on the war by himself. Now that King Philip was home, Eleanor had to be more vigilant than ever. As she feared, Philip wasted no time in stirring up trouble and intriguing with John against his absent brother. Breaking his oath, Philip invaded Normandy and summoned John from England to join him. John was preparing to cross the Channel with an army, but Eleanor beat him to it. She crossed first in the opposite direction. With a speed worthy of Henry, she dashed to London, Oxford, Windsor, and Winchester to talk to the nobles and officials of the crown and officers of the crown. Many of them had already given support to John, who had spread lies that Richard would never return, that he planned to remain in the Holy Land for the rest of his life. It took Eleanor's most eloquent pleas, even tears, to persuade the barons to prevent John from leaving England. Her alertness and persuasiveness saved Richard's realm for the moment.